Hello and welcome to Noble Desktop's live stream of Intro to SQL. My name is Dan Rodney and today I'm going to introduce you to SQL. And this presentation, there's a link to this in the video description down below on YouTube. So I'm going to click back on here. And what are we going to discuss in this webinar? Well, I'm going to talk about what SQL is, what are databases, and why do we need them, because SQL is working with databases. Why do we use SQL? Why is it so popular? How is SQL used across various different industries? I'll give you a live demonstration showing you how databases work and how to write some beginner SQL queries and ways to learn more. I'll turn off my webcam here so that I don't cover up the slides. And let's continue on. So what exactly is SQL? Well, SQL stands, or SQL, SQL as most people call it, but some people say SQL, but a lot of people just say SQL. SQL stands for Structured Query Language. So it is used for querying. Querying means to question or retrieve information that is stored in a database. It is a language. There is a specific structure to it, an order in which you write your queries, and what most people are doing with SQL is they are going to be questioning or retrieving information stored inside of a database. There are other things you can do. You can, of course, insert information. You can update it so that if you need to change it later on, you can. You can delete information in the database as well. So it is a way to manage and retrieve information. A lot of people, when they're using SQL, are doing the querying side of things. So we often say that you are querying the database, and that's what a lot of focus of SQL is going to be. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is the querying side of things. You can also back up your data. You can export it for use in other apps, such as Excel. So it is kind of a multi-purpose language in doing all sorts of things with databases, but it is focused on databases. So what exactly is a database? A database is a collection of tables. Tables contain information. Here's an example diagram showing you some multiple tables in a database, and I'll show you a table in just a second what it looks like when you go inside of it. This is a collection of tables, but here we have user information, information on orders, the line items that each order has, the products that are being purchased, and you can see those here on the right, and you can also see them in a list form over here on the left as well. So you'll notice there's a users table here, and for example, within a user, you'd want to know their name, their email, their password, their address, when they created their account. Then when they place orders, you'd want to know, okay, that user placed this order at this time, and even though they might live somewhere, they might ship to a different address. Orders have certain line items. Those line items have prices with quantities. There's a status for each item that is sold as to whether you've shipped it or not, whether they canceled it. So a database is a collection of tables. Tables contain information in the form of rows and columns. That database lives on a server, and a server can contain many databases. This is just an example of one database. So a table, and in a database there's lots of tables. This is an example of a table. It basically kind of looks like an Excel spreadsheet. You've got columns, you've got rows, but this is a table in a database. So just to make a kind of analogy to Excel, a lot of people are familiar with Excel. Think of a database as kind of like the whole Excel file. In an Excel file, you can have multiple different sheets or tabs, but the whole thing is all of your data all collected into one single place. That's like a database. Now, within a database, you have tables. Tables are the individual sets of rows and columns, and that's kind of like a worksheet or tab in an Excel file. You can have lots of sheets or tabs in an Excel file. You give each one a name so that you know what those sheets are for, and each one of those could be kind of equivalent to a table. This is a rough, kind of rough analogy. Columns are equivalent in both, so columns are for gathering like information. So all your prices would go in one column, all the names of your products would go in another column, and then the rows, you'd have a row for each, let's say, each product. Each product would have a title and a price and a status. So rows would be equivalent to an Excel file for anybody that's familiar with Excel. There are different flavors or kind of variants of SQL as a language. So for the most part, the SQL language, because it is a structured query language, it's pretty much the same everywhere, but there can be some differences. For the most part, they're pretty minor, but so once you learn SQL, you pretty much can use it anywhere, but there are going to be some minor differences. So you do have to know a little bit about which database management system you're using. So DBMS is a database management system, and this is the type of database that you're working with, and they have their own slightly different version or flavor of SQL. So for example, what I'm going to be showing today is something called Postgres. So it's technically PostgreSQL, but most people just say Postgres for short. That is an open source free databasing system that a lot of people use. It's very popular. Microsoft has their version of it, of a SQL database, which is called Microsoft SQL Server for the full name. Most people just shorten that to just SQL Server. So that's Microsoft's SQL Server. There's MySQL and Oracle, and so these are not the only ones, but these are kind of some of the most popular ones. They all have the same fundamental language of SQL. So if you learn it once, you can use it across all of them. But as I said, there might be slightly different things across these different ones. But once you learn it for one, you can, let's say you try to run a query. Let's say you're used to Postgres, and then you want to run a query on SQL Server, and you just write the same query that you're used to writing, and it runs good, no issue. But let's say it creates an error. Well, then hopefully that error is going to give you a clue as to what part there's a problem with, and then you can look up that part and say, let's say for example you're trying to limit the number of rows that are being output, and in Postgres that's limit 10. Which would be top 10 in Microsoft SQL Server. So if you Google limit in SQL Server, because you're used to doing limit in Postgres, then there's going to be some article that's going to say, oh, you can't do limit in SQL Server, you've got to do top. So this stuff has been around for a long time. It's well documented. So if you run into an issue, most likely a Google search will quickly bring you to the answer of how to do one thing in one flavor of SQL, how to do it in another flavor of that. So why use SQL? Why is SQL so popular? If we think about now, data is super important. So we're in the age of big data. Companies are storing all their information in databases because they can't hold all of that on a single, just individual machine. We're connected to websites and social media companies, and there's different places where your data can be on servers, and we want to pool that together and be able to query it. And that's not going to be sitting on one individual user's computer. That's going to be coming from servers on the internet. Also, the size of data. Just imagine you have just terabytes of data. First of all, you might not even be able to fit it on your local machine. You might not have a big enough hard drive, but imagine the performance of this. You cannot store that much data in a single Excel file or CSV file, which is a comma separated value file, which is just like a plain text version of an Excel file. You can't store that much data in a single file and have it be performant. It's not going to perform very well. You try to open an Excel file with almost 1 million rows of data and see how fast it is. Trying to manipulate data and work with an Excel file that large is not going to be fun. So that's the benefit of databases. When you store your information in a database on a server, that server can have lots of storage, be much more powerful than your local machine, and SQL is how you interact with that database on that server. And so pretty much every company is going to have some sort of database, and that's why SQL is so popular. SQL focuses on one thing. Its goal is to work with data and databases. And that singular focus helps its popularity. We don't have tons of different ways of working with databases and data. Pretty much everybody uses SQL. That standardization around one way to do things really helps. For the most part, SQL has not changed that much since it was originally created back in the 1970s. And that might at first sound like, oh, well, why hasn't it changed? Well, because to some extent, databases, there's limited amount of stuff that they do. You're going to create tables, you're going to create your columns, you're going to create your rows, you can insert data, you can update it, you can delete it, you can question it. But for the most part, kind of once that structure of the way that a database works was figured out, it hasn't had to change that much over all of these years. We're storing information. So that's a benefit to SQL, because you don't have to worry about this ever-evolving language. Once you learn SQL, you pretty much know SQL. You don't have to keep learning all sorts of different things about SQL. So that makes it easier to learn, for sure. So just because of its focus, because it hasn't changed super much over all of these years, that just means there's less to learn when you're learning SQL compared to a lot of other languages. For example, JavaScript has tons of different libraries, and those libraries keep changing and updating. New ones come out. Some kind of fall out of favor, and aren't used anymore. So things you learned, you don't use anymore. And they just, like, JavaScript tries to do so many different things. It can do front end logic, interactivity, animation. It can do back end stuff. SQL's very focused, and that helps it to remain a small, focused language that's easier for people to learn with less of a time investment. If you're going to try to learn something like JavaScript, it's going to be a lot longer learning those languages compared to something like SQL. So that's why it's so popular. More people can learn SQL, and they can learn it faster. So compared to most languages, SQL can be mastered much more quickly, and that helps its popularity for sure. And just, you think about how many businesses operate on a database. So the popularity of databases, that SQL is pretty much the standard way that we do interact with those databases. That's why it's so insanely popular, and so many people need SQL. So those are all good things that are in favor of SQL. So why learn it? Here was a quote from somebody learning SQL. SQL is so pervasive, it permeates everything here. It's like SQL syntax persists through time and space. Everything uses SQL or is a derivative of SQL. And that time and space thing is kind of funny, because I think that goes to what I just said about that pretty much it's been the same for a really long time. And that just means that you don't have to keep learning the latest techniques every single year after year. Like, once you get good with SQL, you've learned a skill that will last a lifetime. Like, some things in tech come and go, but SQL has withstood the test of time. It's been around for a long time. I think it's going to be around for a long time. So it's not something that you have to worry, like, should I learn this newfangled thing of the month? SQL's been around. It's got an established history. It's going to be around for a lot longer, so you don't have to worry about it going away, or that you're wasting your time learning some technology that's going to be gone in a year or two. Top 5 things to learn as a data analyst. SQL, 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 SQL. This was in response to a question. Do you have any recommendations for which of the 1,000 tools to learn for an entry-level data analyst? I have a marketing background, but looking to scale up on technical skills. Currently focusing on Python, SQL, Power BI, all good things to learn. But every job description has 10 different tools. And his response was, Seth Rogen's response was, learn SQL, 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 SQL. So just driving home the importance of SQL, specifically in the area of data. So data analysts, data scientists, SQL is so vitally important. Python is also another big one as well, but SQL is so important for people in the data industry, and even related industries. There's lots of people can benefit from knowing at least a little some SQL, that they can go in and start to run some queries, and they can get interesting insights into a business. So in the areas of data science and data analytics, so these are our data industries. On the left here, we have the percentage of all data jobs, and then on the right is the percentage of all data analysts. So slightly different areas here, but for the most part, you look, SQL is number 1. Other things are also important, like Python, machine learning, R, and Spark are the other ones that are in common on both of these. But notice how SQL is number 1. If you look at this, almost 60% of jobs requiring that. If you're looking to get a job in the tech industry, specifically the data industry, certainly things like SQL and Python are the probably two biggest languages that you're going to want to learn. You look at most jobs are requiring SQL for that. And any of these colored pieces of text, those are all links that you can click to go out and learn more. For example, here, if you click on SQL, that takes you to our website to see our SQL courses. And the same thing here with Python will take you out to see our Python classes. And any of these sources where these either quotes come from or the images, I've linked to the source there so you can see where those things come from. Why learn SQL? This was an article that was written just a couple months ago of the most requested tech skills over the past 60 days for when this article was written, which was just on, it was in February of this year. And you look there, aside from people managing projects, SQL, look at the number of tech jobs that they were looking at. Just a lot. And there are other languages that are popular, Python and JavaScript. A lot of people talk about Python and JavaScript when they're talking about languages, but if you leave out SQL, you're leaving out an important language. You look at that, and SQL is huge. So many people need SQL. So many employers are looking for people that know SQL. So when you're looking to get into an industry, and if you're looking to get into the data or tech industry, look at what employers are looking for. And if they're all looking for things like SQL and Python, which data scientists need to know, data analysts need to know, then those are the tech things that you want to learn. So how exactly is SQL used across different industries? Like, what do you do with it? Well, SQL is used on websites because, for example, 40% of all websites use WordPress. And WordPress uses MySQL. That's the database type that they're using. And they store all the website data, blog posts, page content, comments, all that sort of stuff are all stored in a database. And that's just over 40% of websites. All the rest of the websites, not every website needs a database, but a lot of websites will use a database. And they'll use some type of database. Behind the scenes, SQL is being used to create and manage and update and make that database work behind the scenes of a website. So most websites are driven by databases and therefore by SQL. SQL is also important for working with business data. Businesses store their data in databases. So businesses store their information in a database. That's where it's stored, it's retrieved, it's managed. And here's a nice quote from that same article that I linked to earlier. Almost all the biggest names in tech use SQL. So Uber, Netflix, Airbnb, the list just goes on. Even within companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, which are so big that they have to build their own high-performance database systems. As I said before, there's things like Postgres, SQL Server. At the really high-end companies, they might be building their own specific database systems with their own criteria because they just deal at such scale. But the data teams in those companies are using SQL to query the data and perform analysis on that data. So SQL is still backing up all this stuff, even if they have their own flavor, their own specifically tuned database system behind the scenes. And you use SQL to get insights into that data. It's not just, oh, let me create a record, let me update it, but you can query it, and the way that you write a query can give you insights. So let's say in that database, you store information on every client your business has ever worked with. So you're keeping a record of all that stuff. You have your key contacts, you have your details about sales, all that information is in there. But if it's stored and you never look at it, it doesn't do you any good. So you can search that data. And just as an example, let's say you search that data for every client and you find the ones that have spent at least $5,000 with your business or whatever dollar amount you want to insert there. So you're looking for people that have spent at least a certain amount or more over the past decade. You can use SQL to write that query to find those clients. So maybe you're looking for the clients that have spent a lot, so you want to reach back out to them. You want to see, like, when did they last make a purchase with you, when did they last hire you, whatever it is, and you want to reach back out to them because they're a good client. You made money with them before, and maybe want to check back in and be like, hey, haven't seen you in a year, and just want to check back in and maybe make another sale again. So that's very important that you can do that stuff with SQL. So essentially, you can use SQL to answer business questions. You have this question. Well, if you go into your data and you analyze it, you can answer your questions through data. You don't just guess. You can go back and look at stuff. So with SQL, you can query or question the number of purchases. You can look up the number of purchases or job volume, whatever it is. And let's say you look that up by month, by department. You can group it however you want, and you can look at trends in data. You can see, where problems are, like, oh, hey, there's a lot of items. There's a lot of money of returned items. Why do we have so many returns? But if you're not querying your data, if you're not looking at it, and you're not figuring out what you should do based on that data, then you could be missing out on potential revenue or seeing problems and then realizing that you need to fix those problems. So that data can be turned into useful information, actionable insights, if you do the right SQL queries to look in that data and analyze it properly. So that's why SQL is so popular. Businesses like to make money. And if their business data is in a database, you're going to use SQL to query it. And if you say, well, I would just use, this website to run this report. How do you think that report runs behind the scenes? Somebody probably wrote a SQL query behind the scenes to query that data. SQL is what's driving that. So yeah, it's used in web development. It's used in app development for sure. So if data is the true currency of modern business, right, because your information is what tells you useful things, then data jobs must surely be among the most high profile and high paying roles in tech, according to this website right here. Just shows you that SQL is important. Been around for a long time, has a lot of staying power. Excuse me. So enough talking about SQL. Let's take a look at it. I want to show you how databases look, how the tables look, start learning some of the SQL syntax. So let's take a look at this. First of all, we need to be able to connect to a database. Databases live on a server. Now, if you don't have a database that you can connect to for practice, I'll talk about mode.com as a way to start. There's lots of different apps that you can use to connect to a database. A very popular one is called dbeaver. They have a free community edition. It's an open source SQL client. Let me click on this link here. There's two websites, dbeaver.com and dbeaver.io. The .io is the one that has that quick, easy link. This is the download page here to that free community edition. The .com part, there is a paid version of dbeaver which has more features that you can pay for. Notice that is on dbeaver.com. That's the commercial side. So there is like a money-making side to this where you can pay for additional features. But to get started, the free community edition works very well. So you can get started with that one. This is just the app that you'll use to connect to a database. It does not supply the database. It is the app that you'll use to go in and query the database. You can explore the database looking at it. And if you don't have one, I'll talk about this mode.com a little bit later. First, I want to show you dbeaver so you can kind of see how a lot of people are going to be going in and interacting with the database, querying that database. But mode.com is another place that you can use to connect to databases. And they also have a free kind of public data set that you can play around with, which is especially nice if you're just getting started and you don't have a data set or database to work with initially. So let me show you this. I've got dbeaver already launched here. And the first thing that when you start dbeaver is you're not going to have any connections to a database over here. Now, I've already got a database connection over here, but let me show you the way that you would normally have to start this. So let's say you were hired onto a project and they are going to have a database on a server. They're going to need to give you the connection information to log into that server. So we need to define a database connection. Up here in the menu, we have our database menu, and in here you can create a new database connection. Remember that the database is typically not going to be living on your server, on your computer. They're going to be living on the server. So there's some other computer out there on the internet, and you're going to connect into that over the internet to connect into that computer, that server. So I'm going to go to database connection and choose new database connection. And in here, you can see the various different types of databases that you can connect to. This is just the popular list. If you click over here on SQL, you'll see there are lots of different flavors of SQL. But if I just stay here in the popular tab, Postgres here with that cute little elephant icon, that's the one that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be showing Postgres SQL. But there are other things like MySQL, which powers WordPress. There's Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle, as I mentioned before. So there's a bunch of different versions of SQL. But let's say you're connecting to a Postgres database. I would then click Next. And this is where you're going to put in the host. That's going to be the server address that you're going to get from the client that you're working with. They're going to have a database that they have built. There will be a host. This is your internet address that you'll be putting in here, like potentially an IP address. Once you put in that address, it knows how to get there, but it needs to know the database that you're connecting into. And there'll be a username and password for authentication. So you put that information in there. All that information would need to come from the people that have set up the server. They would need to give you permission to log into that server and access that database. Not just anybody can go into any public database and start to poke around, because there can be private business information in there, private individuals' business that you don't want just anybody to be looking at, like their name, email, phone number. You can't expose that stuff publicly. So once you put in the host, the database, the username, password, you can click Finish. And what that will do is that will create a connection over here like I already have. When I go to actually connect to that server, I will open it up and it's going to connect over the internet to that server. And assuming you don't get an error, you did connect to that successfully. If you got an error during that, you can right click or control click and you can edit the connection and you can get back to that dialog and it'll tell you the settings. So maybe you typed in the address wrong or your username or password, maybe you typed that in wrong. Also, the very first time you do it, you might be asked to download some drivers. So if it pops up and says that you need to download something, just go ahead and download that. And that typically is just a one-time install. And once you've downloaded it, you're good to go. So it opened up and I can see databases listed here. Then I know that I am good to go. And I can actually open up the databases there. And I can see that this is the name of the database that I am connected to. I can look into there at schemas, which are a collection of tables. And in there, I've got this public schema. And here's my tables. If I open that up, I can see this list of various tables. And I can double click on any individual table to look at that table. I can see the properties or setup of that table. But if I switch over here to data, it will actually query or question that table and look up what's inside. And this looks a lot like an Excel file, right? So that's for one individual table. Now, if I double click on this other table over here, notice a new tab opens up. So I can see these two different tabs, and I'm looking at the data for that particular table. And I can see the information in this table, like so. So for any of these tables, I can double click, and these are kind of like your worksheets in Excel. So you can switch between them. They're just the tabs are at the top instead of tabs being at the bottom like you're used to in Excel. So these over here are the individual tables, kind of like the worksheets of Excel. Now I can also double click on tables. And let me just close these tabs here for right now. Close those individual tables. If I double click on tables as a whole, there's this ER diagram. And this is a entity relationship diagram. And what this does is it shows you the connections of the data, if there are some. Not all tables are connected to each other. But this just kind of shows the interconnectivity of some of your data. For example, users will make an account on your website. And if I double click on that users table right there, I can actually see the users table. And I can see the user ID, their name, their email, an encoded password. It's not their actual password, just like kind of an encoded version of it. This is all just play data, just for demonstration purposes, not real live data. User address, city, state, zip code. So this is where they live, when the accounts were created at. And so if you think about, people make user accounts, and then they're going to make purchases. So if I close that and I look, the user is then connected to the orders that they make. And the way that we have that connection is that users have a user ID. And that user ID uniquely identifies that user. So there's only ever user ID number 1 is this person. Even if they change their name, even if they change their email, that is a unique identifier for that person. So there'll lots of times be those unique identifiers for those. And other tables will reference that and say, well, that's their user ID. So when somebody makes an order, we'll reference that user ID. So here, this order has its own unique ID, but it references the user ID to say, hey, user number 2, whatever their name is, whatever their email, that can change, but what will never change is that they're user number 2. That's never going to change. That's a unique number just for that user. That will reference it. In fact, if I click on it here, I can see it pulls up that reference over there. And that person made this order. And we can see when they placed the order, where they're shipping it to, which might be different than their name and their home address. And yeah, so all that information is there. In fact, since that references that user, I can also click that little arrow there, and that will actually go to that other table and show me that user information if I want to. So there's quite a bit that you can do without even writing a SQL query in your database app. You can kind of browse through your data, take a look at it, get familiar with it, see what your different table names are, see what data is in each of those tables, because you got to get familiar with the names of your tables and your columns to know what information is where in your database. So most of your apps are going to have some way to explore and view that data. dbeaver is just one app. There are other apps that do similar things. Like, for example, with Microsoft SQL Server, they have their SQL Server app that you can use, which does pretty much the same type of stuff here. So you make your connection, you go in, you take a look at your tables, you start to get familiar with them, and let's say you're ready to start writing a query, which brings you to the SQL language. There's a SQL editor that I don't have open up yet. I want to create a new SQL script. So I'm going to choose that. That's going to create a new file over here on the right. Now it's already connected into my database. So the data source is the connection to your server. And then to the right of that is the active database that you've got. So if this hasn't automatically been selected, I can click up here and see that if I was connected to multiple different data sources, for example, I have maybe 5 different clients I'm working with, I'd want to make sure that I'm working with the proper client. And then once I choose that, on the right-hand side, I can see the list of databases if there are multiple databases. Right now I only have 1. And then in here on the right, I can choose the schema there, which contains all the tables. So on the list on the left, you would choose your database. And then in the list on the right, you choose the schema that contains your tables. Double click on that. So that was automatically done, but it's not automatically done every single time. Like if you open up an old file, that might not have been done. So just keep an eye up there. If that says n/a for not available, it just means that you didn't choose your active data source. And if you try to run queries, those are going to fail. You'll get an error message that says no connection, and you need to go up there and make your connection. So I've got my script here, and I can write my first query. I'm going to hit on the Mac Command plus a few times just to make this bigger. On Windows, you can use Control plus, and actually Command plus and minus on the Mac, make it bigger or smaller. On Windows, Control plus and minus, make it bigger or smaller, just so you can read it. So I want to make sure everybody can read this nicely. All right, so I want to run a query. So I'm going to write a query to not change the database, but just to see what's inside of it. So we are going to choose what we're going to select. So I'm going to select, and right now I'm going to start with the asterisk. Asterisk means all columns. I'm selecting all the columns from one of the tables in my database. And let's say I want to start with users because we were taking a look at users. So when you're done with your statement, you can put a semicolon, and that's the end of that SQL statement. So this is a complete SQL statement. I'm selecting all of the columns from the users table. And again, over here, we see that users table. I want to see the results of this query. So I'm going to come over here, and there's a button to execute that statement. And down below here, I see the results. So you've got your kind of database explorer, your database navigator, as it's called, over here on the left. You compose your queries up top here, and then you see your results. This is called a result set. It's the result of your query. So you can see what that query retrieves from your database for you. Now, in your SQL script, you can write lots of different queries. For example, I don't have to just keep modifying this query that I have. If I ever want to come back to this query, I can just leave this there. And after it, I can hit return a couple times and create a new query. And I can have multiple queries in the same file. Let's say I don't want to, let's say I want to query a different database. So I can say select everything from, and we were looking at the orders table as well. So I can say, let's get everything from the orders table. And you have to make sure you get that name correct over there. So if I select this top query up here, which I can do by just clicking anywhere inside of that line, when I click into that line and hit the run button over here to execute the query, that's going to retrieve the information down here. When I click into this query down below and run it, then I'm going to be getting the results from that query. So you must pay attention to where your cursor is in your app, because it's going to run the query that is currently selected. You don't have to highlight the whole thing. You could just click anywhere in that query to run it. Now, this is something we do all the time. So when I hover over this, it will tell you in parentheses, it has a weird little icon. Those two weird little icons actually mean Control Enter on the Mac. Or your keyboard, depending on what it is, it might say return. Not commands, because I know normally Mac users are used to commands, but on both Mac and PC, this is the same keyboard shortcut. It's Control and Enter or return. So instead of having to click that button every single time, you can hit the Control, you hold Control, and then hit Enter or return, and that will run that query. So most of the time that's what I'm going to do, because I run queries all the time, so I'm not going to keep clicking that little button over there every single time to do it when there's a keyboard shortcut from it. But that's why you have to click into your query and run it, click into your query and run it. Okay, so this gets you all of the columns from a particular table. Most of the time you're not going to want the entire table. You could have just gone and browsed it if you wanted that. You're going to want to filter the results so that you only get some of those. You might not want all of the columns from that database. So I'm going to run this one and see that in that database, or sorry, not database, but table, it's just one table in our database, I'm getting all the columns. But maybe I just want the name and the email list of all the users. So, you know, somebody says, hey, can you get me the name and email of everybody that's registered in our system? So I say, yeah, sure. Let me grab the name. And if I just grab the name and run that, that will just give me the name. But I can also say email as well. And I'm putting in the name of the column as it is in the database. If I say, for example, emails, then I will get an error because emails does not exist. You've got to type in the column name as it exists in the database, which is why it's good to explore the database first to get to know your names of your columns. So that will work because I didn't make a typo in that case. So you can retrieve whichever columns you want from that. That's one way to start to filter down your data. But you also will probably want to filter out some of the rows that you don't want as well. So let me go back to orders. And actually, let's do products. So I'm going to leave these here. I'm going to copy and paste this and just switch this over to the products table because I got a products table over here. Let's take a look at what's in the products table. Again, I'm just hitting Control and the Enter or Return key to run those queries instead of having to click that Run button over there. These are my products. Now we've got our names of our products, we've got prices, we've got different tags, which in this case are colors, but they could be other tags too. And let's say you want to find any product that is tagged cyan. I can put a limit on this. So I could say where, and this column is called tags, where that equals, and let's do cyan. Now, it's important that when you're looking at things over here in a column, when you're looking at these values, that you pay attention to the type of data. You've got numbers, and the numbers, you can see that it's a number here, but it's actually stored as a number in the database. See that this column heading here says 1, 2, 3. So that's a numeric value. It's not just stored as character information, otherwise known as strings. In most programming languages, there's a difference between characters, which are called strings, and numbers. So numeric values you can perform math on. So there'd be a difference between just the character number 1 and the number 1. The number 1 has meaning, 1 plus 1 is 2. You can perform math on it. So in the case of text, text is stored as strings. So ABC, that is a string. So because that's a string, I have to put quotes around this. So I have to put single quotes around that string of text. And I'm going to run that. And now it's filtering it down. Instead of just showing all rows, so we're selecting all the columns from the products table, but only where the tags column contains cyan. So it looks through every row, finds the ones that are cyan, and includes that in the result set. The original table still has all of those things in it. We're not altering the database. We're just querying it. We're just choosing what we want to output into our result set here down at the bottom. Now, an interesting thing about running queries is the reason you have this semicolon is that's the end of a SQL statement. The SQL statement is the entire thing here. You can put these onto multiple different lines to separate things. As you write longer statements, this is going to make it nicer than having it all on one line. Technically, that could all be on one line, but it's going to get really long. So it's easier when you start to put things on different lines. The semicolon is the end of this statement here. When I click into that statement and run it, it runs all of this because I've clicked into there. If I click into this one and run it, it runs that one. But let's say you select something. And this is why you have to actually be careful about what you select. Because if I select just this part right here, which says to select all columns from products, when I run that, I'm going to get all of the products because I did not select the where tags equal cyan. If you have a selection, it will only run what you have selected. That means that if I select just this part, which is not a valid statement, I can't just say select everything without saying where I'm selecting it from. It does not know what table. So I'm going to get an error if I just run that part. It says, hey, no tables have been specified. I don't know where to get those columns from. Sure, you want all the columns, but from where? So if you select a valid SQL statement, even if it's just part of it, it will run that part. If you click anywhere in the statement, then it will run the entire statement. So be careful of what you select. And that's actually a really cool thing because if normally you're filtering it down to just see some of them, you don't have to actually go back and maybe write a whole new statement. You could just go back and select just the part you want to run and go back and see all of those products without writing a different statement. So that's important. And that concept is pretty much true across all of your SQL editors, this idea of selecting or just clicking into a statement to run those things. Normally, you're going to choose either to show all the columns or specific columns from a table, but there's going to be some sort of filtering systems, and there's a lot of different ways you can filter down your data and only show the information that you're interested in. And that's actually most of what learning SQL is all about, is different ways of manipulating data. The quickest way is just to show it all, but that's not very insightful. It's not making it into something that's interesting and useful for you. So different ways we can go about making this interesting is, yes, we can find certain products. We can find just the things that are tagged cyan. But let's say you're looking for the price of products, right? So when I select this top part of the query, there's all different prices. Maybe I'm looking for our more expensive products. So I could say, well, when the price column is greater than a certain amount. Now, this is a number. So when we're dealing with numbers, we don't put quotes around numbers. So let's say I say $80. I'm looking for the expensive things. I'm going to run that query. This returns the most expensive products that are currently in our list of products. I could also say less than, let's say, 20, and then that would show us our low-priced products. So it's a quick way to get insight into the products that you're selling. Then maybe you want to see like, well, what's the kind of most expensive product? You might want to order by that, or just order your list there because you want to see it from like most expensive to least expensive. So the other thing you can do is you can say order by a column, because right now we are not ordering by the price column. So I could order by the price column. And now it's ordered. Right now it is going from a small value to a large value. But I could say that that should be a descending value. So that way it would start with the highest amount on the top and then go down. And lastly, if I were to limit that to one row, I would only get one row in my output, and I now have the most expensive product. That is not the only way to do that query. There are other ways you can do that query, but that's just one approach. And what I wanted to show in this case is that there is a specific order in which you have to build your query. This is a structured query language. There is a specific structure for building your queries. The order in which you write things is important. If I try to put limit up here, for example, it's going to give me an error saying, no, you can't put limit there. After select, it expects a from to come up. Limit can't go there. Now, if you were doing SQL Server, they use a top statement, which they actually put there, which is unusual. Some other languages like SQL Server will do that, but for the most part, the other ones use limit, and limit will always go at the end of things. So there is a specific order in which you put things, and part of learning SQL is learning that order in which you put things. Okay. And I have an example of that in my, actually back in the slides. If I hop back over to my slides, this is the structure of a SQL query. So you have select, you have from, and then a couple other things like join, where, group, having, order, and limit. So this is kind of the order in which you build up your queries. And as you learn SQL, you learn the various features, you learn what they do, and the order in which you write a query to be able to filter down to just the data that you're actually looking for. Okay. And let's do a couple more things here, and then I'll show you that if you're not using something like dbeaver, if you want to get started on your own just pretty quickly, you can go to mode.com and use some of their test data. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But let's just do a couple more queries here. Let's say we're doing, I want to go and get everything from the line items table. Now the line items table is containing each item that is made in an order. So each of these will reference the order that was made, and you can have like 10 different line items on an order. They're separate because each line item is for one product that has its own price and its quantity, and that product might have to wait a while before it ships. Maybe another product ships out earlier than another one. You don't always complete an order as a whole, all as one thing. You might independently deal with all the line items in that order. So if I'm looking at those line items, I might want to get some insights into those line items. I'm going to put this onto two different lines just to make this a little bit more legible. So right now I'm selecting all the columns from the line items table. Let's say I want to focus on the quantity of things or the price of things. So I could say I want to get the quantity from line items, and that will just retrieve the quantity column. Now maybe I want to see how many things did I sell. I have to add all of those quantities up. That is called an aggregation function. We can sum all of those quantities. And if you've ever done this in Excel, it's kind of similar to the way you would do it in Excel. That will add up all of those things, and we can see that we have sold 1,845 things. That's the total quantity. Now, if we did the price, so let me keep that and do another query here. Let's say I grab everything from line items and we see the price column. If I grab all of the prices that are in here, this is a list of all the prices. If I sum up all the prices, that would sum it all up, but it would not be the answer that I'm necessarily thinking about. Think about the original table. Let's say I select everything from that line items table. If you're getting the total dollar value of everything you've sold, you can't just consider price because that's the price of one item. If somebody purchased 10 of those, it would actually be 10 times that price. So you can't just add up just the prices. You have to add the price times the quantity. And I like to put spaces around there just to make it a little bit more legible. So if I do that, then there's a whole lot more sales than if I just added up all the individual prices and forgot about all the quantities that I have sold. So this is a way that you can look into your data and start to figure things out. You can end up grouping by things, and there's all sorts of different things you can do to get insights into your data. This is how dbeaver works, and pretty much how any database app that you're going to use to run your SQL queries will work. Let's say you don't have a database to connect to yet. Let me pop back over to my browser, and there was a link earlier to mode.com. You can go to mode.com and you can sign up for a free account. And when you first sign in and go to create the account, it's going to ask you to make a connection to a database. But let's say you don't have one. There'll be an option in there that you can choose to use their public data set for doing some testing on. And I've already done that. So it's created one that it used to be called Untitled. I just changed it to Demo here. And I'm going to click into there, and I'm going to edit this one. And once you choose their public data source here, on the right, you can see that we're in the Modes public warehouse. So this is available to everyone. And these are a bunch of different databases, tables. So this is the public warehouse is the database, and these are all tables inside of that. And this is stuff that you can query. So if you don't have your own connection to a database and you still want to get started and try some things out, this is one way to do that. So let's say, for example, accounts. I'm curious what's in accounts. Well, I can click on it and I can see that there's a name, there's a contact, but if I actually want to see it, there's a little play button over here that I can do. And watch over here in the query area when I click the play button. So that's going to load that query up over here, and it's actually going to run that query. And I don't need this little comment here. Let me make this bigger. I'm going to hit the Command plus to make this bigger. I don't need this comment there. I'll delete that and just focus on this. And let's go down to just this. Select all the columns from, and this is the tutorial database, and this is the accounts table in that tutorial database. So that's going into this public warehouse. See, this is the database called tutorial, and in the tutorial database, we've got these tables. So this retrieves the columns and rows from that table. Let's say you only want the name and primary contact. So I'm going to copy and paste that here. Instead of selecting all the columns, I can say the name and the primary contact. Notice how it code hints, and you can use your arrow keys to come down here and choose it. So I can get the name and primary contact, and I can run that. So I click run. That'll run the query and show the results down below here. So kind of like dbeaver, but what's nice about this is you can get some sample data without you having to even have a database. You could just use their public stuff just to practice making your queries. All right, and you don't have to make a connection or anything because they've already got that for you. What else can we do here? There are some other databases in here that we can query. So let's say we've got down here city populations. So I'm going to click city populations, and I'm going to delete this other stuff here and just do city populations. Delete all this other extraneous stuff. This is a list of the different populations. They're pulling from some old data here. Doesn't really matter what year or anything. This is just for sample stuff. So they break it down by city and state. So within a state, there might be multiple cities. Let's say you want to kind of order this stuff. You could say up here, order by, and then you could say state, and I could run that. And then at least I have all the cities for each state listed in order. Before it was just kind of in a more random order. And then you want to get some more kind of further insights into this. Let's say you're curious, well, okay, there's multiple cities per state, and I can see for each city what the total population estimate is. But what if I just want to total that up per state? Because right now I'd have to go in and manually add those up, but of course I don't want to do that manually. I want it to do this for me automatically. So what I'm interested in is state data, and I'm interested in the population estimate. I'm interested in those two things. And I did the same keyboard shortcut here, the Control Enter, and here actually Command Enter also works. So I've got the state. I see there's multiple ones listed because those are the different cities. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to group it by the state. And so I'm going to group it by that state. So it's going to take all three of those for Arizona, and how many ever there are for each state is going to group them together. but I need one single sum of all of those population estimates. So I'm going to put on a sum onto that population estimate. So that's going to sum that up by state. It's going to group it by the state and add those all up by those groups. I'm going to run that query. And there was a problem with my query. What was my problem here? Oh, silly me. That's a good mistake to make, actually. You have to put things in the right order. I accidentally put my group by after my order by. That has to come second. Good lesson there. So we select our columns from a database, then we group, and when we're all done, once we have the final data, then the last thing we do is we order by that. So you got to put things in the right order. There we go. So now we have grouped by each state. So now instead of having 3 for Arizona and how many ever there were for California, we have grouped those together. And now over here, this is the sum of each of those groups. So that's just a taste of what SQL can do. It can certainly do a whole lot more than that. But the main points here is that you can choose the columns and the rows that you need. You can start to perform analysis on them. You can order your results. There's a lot of different ways to manipulate the information that you have that's in your database and turn it into a useful report in the end. This is a listing of that order, and see here how the group by needs to be before the order by. So you need to get used to this order for your queries. Okay. If you want to learn more, we do have hands-on classes that you can take either by coming to New York City and attending our school in New York City. We're in Midtown, a block away from the Empire State Building. Or you can take our classes live online. On our website, all of our classes are listed in Eastern Time because we're based in New York City. But you can take them live online. You can screen share into the instructor computer, see what they're showing, learn about SQL, do hands-on practice exercises where you can build queries. We'll have you connect into our database so you can run queries using dbeaver. So if you click on there, you can check out our SQL Bootcamp, where you can learn more about SQL in a hands-on class. Those are live interactive classes that you can go through. That's if you just want to learn SQL. If you want to learn more, if you want to get into data science or data analytics, these are certificate programs which you can check out. And in here you can see that we have a data science certificate. We also have a data analytics certificate. In those certificates, let's say for data science, in there, if we look at the curriculum, there you're going to learn not only SQL, but you also will be learning Python as well. Python and SQL are the 2 biggest languages for data, and so you're going to learn both of those in there. If you look at the data analyst certificate and you look at the curriculum for that, in there you're also learning Tableau, and Tableau is good for data visualization, because with data analytics you're going to turn your analytics, which there's also more in analyzing data, which data analysts also use Excel as well, because some things can be done with Excel. So we use a combination of Excel, Python, and SQL, depending on where your data is. And then you can use Tableau to visualize that, because if you're creating analytics, often visualizing those to bring them into some easy to understand graphic makes your data more meaningful instead of just trying to read a chart. So Tableau is for data visualization. You'll learn that in our data analytics program. Again, all of these can be taken live online, and as well as if you want to come into New York City to our school, you can do that. Noble Desktop has been around for over 30 years. I've personally been teaching at Noble Desktop for over 20 years, and I love teaching there. We have great courses for people to get started in this stuff, whether it's an individual class that you want to take or part of a bigger certificate program. So thank you so much. I hope this has been enjoyable for you. Again, for the people that want to go back to this presentation, just check out the link in the video description down below here on the YouTube video, and there'll be a link to this presentation, so you can click the links that are in here and go check out any of the information for your reference. Thank you so much, and have fun learning.